I've experimented with a lot of different focal lengths throughout the years of doing street photography. I own all the classic focal lengths and I've expanded my collection even more in the recent year. When I look back, I've had a few aha moments that have become defining moments for me and my street photography journey. If I had to name one focal length that has had the biggest and most profound impact on me as a street photographer and my street photography, it has to be the 28mm focal length. Before we get started, I just quickly want to introduce myself if you're new to the channel. So my name is Embreen, aka Hipster in Copenhagen. I'm a street photographer and I've been taking street photos for the last 8 years and counting. So I talk about street photography on this channel. I have a website where I also have a newsletter and a blog. So I would say I am very much into street photography. Some might call it obsessed with it. So do check it out and let's get back to the video. The 35mm focal length is just a bit boring for my taste. It's very versatile and a great all-round lens, but sometimes I feel like it's missing some character. The 50mm focal length is my absolute favorite focal length, even though it's not wide enough always for street photography. The 85 is great for subject separation and that dreamy bokeh. But often it feels too tight, and these days I mostly use it for something specific or stylized photographs. It's my safe space, but feels like my inner stalker just come out with this focal length a tiny bit. And then there is the 28mm. It just seems to feel right, at least for now. It's no secret that I like longer focal lengths to do street photography. My longer focal lengths like the 55 and the 85mm have been my safe space when I was learning street photography all those years ago. I never liked wide-angle lenses or used one, and I never considered buying one to add to my street kit. But I actually started out on a 35mm equivalent, which is technically a wide-angle lens. From there I jumped to the 85mm, then the 55, and now I'm completely obsessed with the 28mm wide-angle lens. The 28mm focal length is a very unique focal length. It's wide, but it's also small, and it sits in the perfect sweet spot of being the best focal length to do street photography with. Well, at least according to some street photographers. As I mentioned before, this focal length is certainly wide, but it's not too wide so it distorts photographs and faces. Unless you take a photograph from a low angle, then some distortion might happen. Maybe that's why the Leica Q series and the Ricoh GR series are so popular with street photographers to do street photography with, because they have that 28mm focal length. The 28mm is a great compromise between speed, size, and price. Often they are very lightweight and easy to carry when you're doing street photography, and often they're also very fast, so they can go down to 1.8 or maybe even lower. And the price is not bad either compared to other wide-angle focal lengths. A little fun fact when we're talking about wide-angle lenses, so the ultra-wide-angle lenses like the 10mm or the 16mm, they're very difficult to manufacture because first of all you have to use really optimal glass that goes all the way to the edges of the element, and that makes them big, heavy, and expensive. The 28mm focal length can be used for multiple purposes and is quite versatile, so let me tell you about it. So first of all, it can be used for landscape photography because it has that slightly wider field of view compared to a 35mm. And also, as I mentioned before, it's quite lightweight, so it's easy to carry around. So that way you can do street photography, and if you see something that you want to take a photograph of, like a landscape or a building, like architecture, because it is that versatile. And also, it's great for street photography. I use it myself for street photography, and it's a favorite among purists. Portraits can also be done. There are street photographers out there that swears to this focal length. I don't know how to do portraits with a 28mm. I think you have to stand really close to them. But again, it doesn't distort faces, so that might be why people love it, especially for body shots. So that's why this focal length is so flexible and adaptable, in my opinion. There are so many options on composing with this focal length. You can really get up close and really focus on a subject or element that you're trying to capture. It's really good also for tight spaces, so if you're doing a family event indoors like a birthday, but this also goes for the streets. So if you're photographing a street that is a bit more narrow than usual, it will be perfect here as well. If you decide to take a step back with this focal length, you suddenly have the option of including more of the scene and the environment that you're trying to capture. And that is really great for storytelling and capturing those documentary style photographs. So with the 28mm, you can actually capture a lot in the frame, so like big groups or a single subject. Often what I do when I go out and shoot with a 28 is that I try to take a photo where the subject is at the end. And this is doable with this focal length, as I mentioned before, because it doesn't distort that much. So I really come to like that compositional technique where the subject is at the end and you have a lot of negative space. So that way I also show the scene, but I still have a subject in my photographs. Another thing with this focal length is because it is so wide, you have more of the scene and the environment, and that means that the bokeh will not be as pronounced as if you're using a tighter focal length. Let's talk about how this 28mm focal length has impacted my street photography in a few ways. I mostly use the 28mm focal length to do candid street photography, and I have my Fuji X100V. So technically it's a wide conversion lens, so basically it's a converter that you put on your existing focal length. So the Fuji X100V has a native 35mm equivalent, and when I put on this converter it becomes a 28mm focal length. So when I'm not feeling up to using a 28mm, I can just take it off so the camera goes back to the native 35mm. So it's quite versatile having a conversion lens. I really like the slightly wider field of view I get with the 28 compared to the 35, which I sometimes think is a bit boring to do street photography with because it is just that standard wide angle that is very versatile, as I mentioned, but sometimes I'm just looking for that extra scene that I can add or elements that I can add to my photographs, and that you can definitely get with the 28mm. I also use this focal length for non-street photography work, so basically taking pictures of my friends and family. And in Copenhagen we have really tiny apartments, and the 28mm is just great. That way people don't have to squish together so much and I don't have to stand on the opposite side of the room. So it's quite versatile, as I mentioned before. What I really love about this focal length is that it gives that visual intimacy to my photographs when I'm out doing street photography. And right now I'm really loving shooting in black and white, so I made a whole video about it and you can check it out in the description below. And black and white gives that classic timeless look and feel to my photograph, and comparing that with a 28mm, I can get those raw intimate photographs that I really love. The 28mm focal length has definitely evolved and changed my shooting style and the way I move on the streets. When I'm using the 28mm, I adopt a hunter street photographer shooting style. You can learn all about the different techniques like the fishing or hunting techniques in another video I just recently made. You can find the links in the description below. But basically when you adopt a hunter street photographer shooting style, that means that you are more on the prowl. You hunt your subjects a bit more. And the other thing is that I move really fast. I have a really rapid pace, so I hardly wait for a subject to enter a frame. I don't set up a frame. I just see something, a situation or a subject that I want to capture. And if I can't capture that, I just move on. I don't sit there and wait. So that's what I mean by kind of change my shooting style and the way I move on the streets. And also with this focal length, you have to be a lot closer to your subjects if you want to capture a good, raw, intimate photograph. This focal length has also really changed how I think about and visualize my compositions and how I frame up my shots. So as I mentioned before, I really like those unique and dramatic viewpoints to a photograph. So basically where I have the subject at the end of the photograph with a lot of negative space. And that just creates a unique photograph because I have much more of the environment and the scene in the frame. So you can see where the photograph has been taken, but there's still a subject, and it's almost like my subjects are escaping me and my camera. So a little bit like hide and seek, and I really like that look. Things really started to change a lot for me in my street photography when I started to use zone focus. This is something I've talked about in my other videos as well, but this is really great for doing candid street photography. So with zone focus, the camera is pre-focused to a set distance like 2 meters, 2.5 meters, 5 feet, 8 feet to infinity. And that way you don't have to worry about out of focus, because often you have to engage the camera and it's out of focus. And by then the subject and the moment can be long gone. So this is why I really like to have zone focused as a perfect companion to candid street photography. And it's also really great, as I mentioned before, with the fast movement of candid street photography, when you have that rapid pace and the camera is just pre-focused, and it's so much easier. I just have to look for a moment or anticipate a situation and the camera will be ready as long as I'm ready to pull that trigger. The last thing I want to mention are the streets and the environment itself and how big a role they play in order for the 28mm to really shine. The 28mm has its absolute strengths to be used in tighter spaces or kind of those narrower streets. And this is especially great in Copenhagen, where the streets are that much narrower and smaller. So we don't have those big wide streets and big blocks like you have in New York or Toronto. And that way I can be so much closer to my subjects. Because if the streets were wider, I have to use a wider focal length because I don't have to chase my subjects in the same way. I hope that makes sense, but it really shines with those narrower and tighter spaces. This is why I love, maybe obsessed about this 28mm for street photography, because I can continue to hone my skills as a street photographer, and it's just so much fun. All right, I'll see you in the next one.